Thanks everyone for coming out tonight in the rain and all of this. So, an interesting question, which is a practitioner in user experience testing for probably about 30 years. You always get is why should we test the user experience? And there's the obvious the points here to reduce risk, identify opportunities, obviously very important, set priorities, improve the probability of success. Sort of at the bottom line. That's what we're really all, ultimately talking about. But in the last 10 years or so, there's been a considerable amount of research done around the idea of what attributes contribute to the success of a software project. So if we ask the question, what objective research is there out there today that talks about what contributes to a successful project and what role user experience plays in such a project, or such projects, there's actually some very interesting data. So if we ask the sort of the larger question, how successful are projects today? And I'm sure by looking at the list of respondents, I see that we have individuals from huge companies running very large projects down to two-person startups. So if you actually look at the data here, and this is from the Standish group, they looked at over 10,000 projects over a 8-year period. And it's kind of interesting. If you look here, this is project size, and number of team members, time, and the success rate. And as you increase in project size, there's really no magic here. Bigger projects, bigger budgets, larger teams, larger sets of product attributes and features result in less levels of success. Success defined in this particular study as on schedule, on budget, and features as promised. So you can think of the sort of the problem that user experience research is addressing today is how do you optimize against this level of ineffectiveness? And the question would be, of course, what is the role of user experience in improving the outcomes of these types of projects on these scales? So the obvious question is, what are there factors that are actually correlated with positive project outcomes? And you can look at, this is a randomized list of variables. In fact, there's been a considerable amount of research done on this. They give this list to development teams, and they would say, okay, let's, individuals or together, collectively, give us your priority in terms of what you think on this list are the top 5 attributes that would be identified with product success. So if I ask the group here today, what do you think are the top 2? What would you say? Anybody have a guess? Okay. 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 If you ask a development team of almost any size, competent staff is first, firm basic requirements is second, proper planning is third, executive support is fourth, and ownership, who controls it, is fifth. So, it's interesting research. It's been around for a long time. And what's particularly interesting about the Standish study is that they went and looked at over these 10,000 projects. They said, okay, of those which were most successful, small to large, what were the factors that contributed most to success on these projects? And their finding was really quite different. So this is the contribution to success. It's 100 points on the vertical scale here. The criteria is obviously slightly different, but what they found in this study is that, in fact, early and continuous user involvement has the highest predictive value of long-term success in a project. Notice that these are countervailing with respect to the top 4. So you have an intuition based on how development teams think about what contributes to success versus those which we know objectively, research shows us, actually map to effective projects. So this is probably one of the most interesting and relevant pieces of research that supports why you want to test your user experience. And you can see, from this, from the significance of user involvement here, sort of the early structure of Agile and some of the other development disciplines, which we now see are focusing on short-term, rapid iterations of high user involvement. Okay, so this final piece here, and this is one which I think, as business owners, as participants in large projects, small projects, ultimately the question is, what is the business reason for doing this? And I think, there's lots of research on this. The best piece, the best chart, I think, that explains this is from Bob Pressman's book. Any of you who have a degree in computer science, you'll know Bob Pressman's book on software engineering. And this is a cost of fixing the software problem versus phase of development. Design, development, post-introduction. This is one problem and this is 10 problems. This is sort of the chart from a business point of view that defines why you want early user involvement. Because if you identify critical incidents, error states, problems, lack of a suitable feature presentation, for example, in the design phase, your business is going to be successful because you're going to have money upstream that you wouldn't have to spend fixing problems that could have been easily identified early in the development cycle. Okay, so, you can sort of package all this up. I've given you a very sort of highly condensed view on what what is the structure behind the business problem related to user experience testing. But at the end of the day, what you're really concerned about is the earliest identification of the most critical problems and opportunities, because user testing in its most effective form identifies opportunities as well as identifying problems. And in fact, Rob is going to talk about that. And this last part, which is critical at the least cost. A tremendous amount of usability testing, user experience testing, all of this kind of structured testing has been floating around the environment for the last 10 years. Has frankly, a lot of it has been costly, and much of it has been quite ineffective. And what we'll talk about, as we go through the evening here, is dominant methodologies, but also ways in which, looking at the new environment, you can reduce cost and produce very effective results. When you actually look at the trends of what's happening in the larger context of the sort of interconnectedness of devices, all of you today who are sitting there, at work working on websites, those types of interactions are going to be moving very rapidly across all different types of devices. So I think it's very important from a sort of strategic point of view to think about UX design and in the context of its future, of how it impacts user engagement, not only on web-based or mobile devices, but also on these other types of physical products, all of which eventually will be highly interconnected. So we have a simple model here. We call it the engagement pyramid. And you can think about UX performance in a sort of a simple way. At the top of the pyramid, you could have a situation where there's virtually no engagement. That means that the user can't find the features, your critical features, and if they could find them, they couldn't figure out how to use them anyway. Then you have low engagement. They can find them, they can figure out how to use them, but they don't want to. Then you've got moderate level of engagement, where they can find the features, they understand how to use them, and they have some interest in doing so. So, most of the engagement that we have in user interfaces today, especially those that are screen-based, web-based, it falls sort of in the category of moderate engagement. You look at a typical site, something like 85 to 90% of the features are used less than 5% of the time. So you've got, on average, a relatively low utilization, low engagement level, and generally speaking, a high degree of over-engineering in terms of unused features. And then, of course, at the bottom, you've got deep engagement. So, in this case, you've got, the user can find the features, they understand how to use them, almost as quickly as possible, and they basically can't stop using them. So, the point is that user testing is effective across, all of these domains in terms of measuring engagement. And at the end of the day, what we're all trying to do here is move to a level of deep engagement with our technology. That's where the business opportunity is. That's where the growth is in the marketplace. We would all like to have, like Facebook, an average of, I guess it's now up to an hour and 40 minutes a day, engagement. So the fact is that user experience research, specifically in web-based interfaces, it's very infrequent that designers are trying to find out why exactly is it that certain types of products, let's say, Pinterest, for example. Wouldn't you like to know why it's so successful? And there are methodologies now where you can look at that kind of question very objectively and scientifically. Okay, so I'm going to take you through a few methodologies here. These are focused more on web-based interfaces, some mobile applications. The first is eye tracking, and I know most of you probably are familiar with what eye tracking is. The business problem is simply that it allows you to look at what users are, what they're seeing and in what order. The respondents view the screen-based system like you see here. Anything that can be presented on a screen can be eye tracked, basically. Anything from advertisements to websites. And vendors now have come out recently in the last year with these very spiffy goggles, which you can wear. And you can navigate the environment, any environment with these, and it completely tracks the environment. So, it has a very interesting application. Used it extensively in the last 6 months in driver evaluation of the impact of cell phone use on driving behavior. But a very interesting new technology. The benefit is obviously it's very accurate. Its limitations is high cost. The analysis is actually quite complex. And contrary to what a lot of vendors will tell you, the data can actually be very deceiving. The data is basically eye fixations and heat maps. You've seen these. They're quite charming to look at visually. The tools of choice are Tobii and SMI. SMI is a relatively new company on the scene in terms of trying to penetrate the usability space or UX space. The cost per respondent is relatively high, and you have some level of statistical validity, if you think it's important. For those of you who haven't seen it, here we have Barbie. And the typical eye tracking study, these are fixation points. These are points on the interface where the user, where they've actually fixated, they've stopped for a sub-second and fixated. And so you get this is called a fixation matrix. And then you also get these, sort of characterized as heat maps. And these are dwell time on a given subject. So the great thing about eye tracking is that, with respect to web design, it was never designed to do any of this. It was actually designed originally in the 1950s to study the detection, or actually in the 1940s, in its earliest phase, to study the detection of certain types of military targets and on discrimination tasks of that sort of more of a military context. So an interesting point about all this is that eye tracking is probably one of the only methodologies currently that is actually a good visualization of what's happening in cognitive science. So if you look at an eye tracking study, you can, and you have knowledge of cognitive science, especially in the visual processing domain, you can predict to a high degree what the eye tracking is actually going to show when they actually do it. So for example, this is a website, very popular, 2 million visitors. Why will respondents never view the navigation bar? It's an interesting question. And I'm talking about that only on this site. Okay, so here's the navigation bar. And we all know that you want to get into the navigation structure from any comm point of view as quickly as possible. So an example of how eye tracking reinforces recent advances in cognitive science. It turns out that the perception of faces has its own, it's called the fusiform section here, the human brain. It has its own map, which we've recently discovered in the last 10 years, unlike other visual processing portions of the human brain. So if you look at, for example, we're back up at Barbie here, Barbie's face is the quintessential, highly refined definition of what we find engaging in looking at a face. It is, if you had to scientifically design a face, you couldn't make it better or more sort of salient than the creation of Barbie. The proportions, the shape of her neck, her eyes, the shape, So what this shows us essentially is that you can look at eye tracking data, you can see what these fixations are, but at the end of the day, we're sort of hardwired in terms of what we're actually going to fixate on a given web page. And one of the things that is always surprising is that if you have a page loaded with faces, they're not going to see anything else but the faces. We've seen this in dozens of studies that we've done over the years. So what happens when you turn the, when there's no faces? This is a competitive site. This is Toys R Us. Doesn't have any faces on it. So what happens actually is that the human information processing system says, okay, there's no faces. I'm not going to give any priority to that. I'm going to look at those areas which are, they have the highest figure ground contrast, these edges, and some of this text. So what this technique actually is capable of doing is a highly refined way of looking at what is actually taking place in the human mind. And the interesting connection is that we haven't been able to actually understand, sort of from a cognitive point of view, what was happening until the last 10 years with brain imaging. So now we can sort of link up eye tracking with cognitive science, and it's actually a very interesting time in both fields. Okay, now one of the things I like to show you, I'll show you a quick video here. Okay, so this is actually a test. So we know we have lots of smart folks in the audience tonight. Kind of folks that love tests. Okay, so this is going to be a video. It's going to run. And the question, what you're trying to solve is there's two groups here. There's a black group, have black t-shirts on, and a white group, they have white t-shirts on. And the question is, count how many times the player is wearing white past the ball. And you have to focus intensely on this or you won't be able to answer the question. Okay, so we'll take a look at this. So watch it carefully. Okay, what's everybody guess? 16. Any other number? You've seen this. Okay. So here, let's look at what the research shows. This is actually from a very famous research study. Okay, so it's 16. Okay, so here's a more interesting question. How many spotted the gorilla? Truthfully. Okay. You probably saw this before, all of you. What can I say? The fact is that looking through the center of that actually was a gorilla. They walked right through the center. We'll see it again here. Okay. So for all of those of you who are researchers who saw this before, seen this video before, it's actually well known in the cog sci space. We'll see how smart you are. Okay. So let's say you knew about the gorilla. In the real study, about half the people never saw the gorilla. Did you? No. Okay. Watch this. So we'll run this back. Okay. Okay, she leaves. There's the gorilla. Yeah. Did you notice also the curtain changing color? Okay. So this is technically called the monkey business illusion, and it's a couple of famous professors have worked on this for a number of years. The point why it's relevant to what we're talking about with eye tracking, and I've seen this for a long time. Do not make the assumption because you paid for a $30,000 eye tracking study and you look at those maps that the users have actually cognitively integrated or seen on the screen what they show. It's oftentimes not the case. So I know that's probably crushing to all of you who've paid for these studies, but it's actually true. Okay. Okay, so the question is, what is eye tracking technology really good for? I have another short video here. This is actually an example of the technology utilization that is really quite effective. Okay, so here you see this is eye tracking. I'm just going to let it run through once quick. Okay. What do we learn from that? It's incredibly important. What we learn from this is the impact of animated advertising. Okay, so the business objective is right here. Click for a free profile. That's the acquisition model. That's what you're trying to do. That's where the business is. So if you, let's say for example you have a site and you test it extensively with the user, does extremely well. Then at a certain point, the site goes live and you see big dips in your performance, especially in behavior off the homepage. One of the things that I'm always surprised about is that clients oftentimes won't correlate ad delivery with performance on the home page. So now watch this. Watch what happens. This is their actual. This is where they. This is the first fixation. And watch what happens with the ing ad when it loads. You'll see the faces here in a minute. Okay, here's a little more animation on the bottom. Now you're going to get the faces. So it's just a very short, simple example of how you can use eye tracking technology in a very controlled way, the way in which it was designed. Basically, in a short format study where you're looking at very highly controlled sort of stimulus-response relationships on a website that you already know the performance on. So for these types of advertising-based, impact studies, actually eye tracking is invaluable. Okay, well, I'd like to move on now to another interesting methodology. It's large sample online behavior tracking. The major business problem here is, let's say you have a very large website, complex website, it's business critical, and you're undergoing a major redesign. This is a sort of a tool of choice for a number of reasons. And it allows you to have between 2,000 and 10,000 respondents. They undertake tasks in an online tracking and survey tool. These tools combine sort of this behavior tracking with surveys. Obviously the benefit is very large sample size, low cost. Its limitations obviously are no direct observation of users. The survey design can be complex. The data, you can get anything you want out of this. These studies are amazing if you're a researcher or if you're a business executive and you really want to understand what impact design changes are having on your customers, on your users. So these tools, a number of these tools, they'll export to anything, SPSS, any type of statistical program you want, and you can go to town. Tool of choice here is Keynote Web Effective or UserZoom. We've used Keynote for many years. It's our firm's tool of choice. We've not used UserZoom, but we hear good things about it. The cost per respondent is quite low, and the statistical validity is basically whatever you want, because the sample size is so large. So this is the way these studies work. Very quickly, you get an invitation. When the user selects the invitation, incidentally, these are all incentivized studies. That means that they either get a direct Amazon gift certificate or they get entry into a substantial sweepstake. Incidentally, the Amazon gift certificates deliver by far the best response rate. So if they say, okay, I want to take this study, the system automatically, when they launch it, it downloads a little applet to their system, which essentially tracks on a micro level their interactive behavior. And I want to point out that there's two types of studies. There's this what we call the connector type, and then there's remote. And many studies or clients today will not allow, or users of the respondents will not allow a download. So what you have to do is take a sort of a much less powerful version of this study as a methodology. So you get a little introduction here. It tells you basically what you're going to do. It's going to be 35, 40 minutes. The typical study like this will have a $20 Amazon gift certificate. And description of how the tasks of what you're going to be doing. The tasks pop up once you say you want to do the study. You get a task description here. It's generally a pop-up. It tells you to, I think in this case, find the music section, I guess. So you dismiss it, you go and do the task, and then you collect the answer question. Incidentally, the task is repeated up here. And all the time that this is taking place remotely, the system is tracking the user's behavior. And then, of course, you can deliver any type of question after they're done with the task that you can imagine. And they get a thank you and an incentive delivery. So the interesting question here is when you use this type of methodology, especially if you have a complex website, what type of data do you actually get? So here's a summary. This is actually in an article that we published last year. So you can look at website performance in terms of user experience, sort of aggregated into overall visual design, clarity, ease of understanding, communication of total content, overall ease of use. These categories are actually aggregated summaries. Behind each of these categories, a number of question sets. Okay. And the way this reads is a standard. This is what they call a spider chart. So if you rated something very poor, you'd have an ordinate here, or there's actually be out there. This is a 5-point scale. It's the way to think of it. So if you had the user experience was like totally amazing, you'd have a red line all the way around the outside, right? So this is just a sample of what the data can look like, and obviously what I'll show you is percentage of respondents who rated certain aspects of the site. So what many large groups have started doing is what is technically called a benchmark study. So here I'll show you the data. This is the site before it was redesigned. This is a very big site. It's not NTD's. And a large team. There's probably 150 individuals on this team, multi-million-dollar project. And this is the benchmark before redesign. Okay, so you can see basically how it rated on these aggregated scales. So the first redesign looks like this. They got their money's worth. I mean, this is a big improvement. It's, talking to studies, 1,500 individuals in the study. It's an online behavior tracking study. And so they have another redesign here. Things are getting a little better, but if I ask you on this chart, what is not really improving, what would you say? Overall visual design, right? Okay. So imagine you're a manager. You've retained a top interactive agency, and they have, as we all know, their own style. And in this particular case, this client had to make a decision. Okay, are we going to stay with what we have here in terms of visual design, or are we going to have to change course? Are we going to have to take a new design approach here? And in fact, they did take a new approach. But as a manager of a very large project spending millions of dollars, this is extremely valuable because you're not going to have to fool around with these other aspects, especially ease of use. You've got your usability in definitely an acceptable range. So spend the money where the problem remains. So this is the final cycle. It's actually a great case study. I think this is about 18 months. There's about 6 months between each of these iterations, and you can see that it shows very graphically the true impact. And how many of you have worked on huge projects? At the end of the day, you have no idea what impact it actually had on the end. Right. So I think these types of tools are going to be commonplace in the next 5 years. So if I ask you, where is the one problem that needs, now they're done, where do they need to spend more effort? Yeah, right. Communication of total content. So what do we know that is? What kind of problem is that? That's a homepage problem, right? because you've got maybe 20 seconds or so. This is a media site, big media site. The key thing is, can you demonstrate, can you present the scope of content rapidly so that the user of this site, the customer for this site, is going to have confidence in the brand. And in this particular case, what they were interested in was expanding the brand. So site is basically okay, they're going to leave that alone, and they go off on a homepage project. And that's what they do. Okay, here's another interesting question. What impact does change in visual design have on critical users? So we all see these projects where you go and completely restyle the site. The question is, what impact does it have? So here we have 4 panels. The light blue here is the general population, and increasing value. Value is, in this particular case, is sort of, percentage of wallet is a way of thinking of it. Okay, and this is a standard semantic differential scale. You can easily present these, in an interactive environment. But what you see here is incredibly important. The highest value panel has the strongest response to the visual redesign. Sometimes you'll see this the other way. You'll see this over here. So this is very valuable to a design team, because you can see incrementally that the changes that you're making are impacting your most valuable customer. Another slide here, nomenclature. On these types of studies, you can really study almost anything you want. And one of the areas that we know from lots of research is that the labels on your navigation are probably the single largest predictor of usability of your site. I know that sounds hard to believe. You spend $1 million on interactivity, but at the end of the day, we initially assess the usability and the interactive quality of a site by reading what's on the page. So if you evaluate the terminology on your site, you can determine to a great extent its usability. So this is another spider chart. So if there was a line all the way on the outer limit here, that would mean that these terms were understood, had perfect comprehension, and if they understood, once they were shown the content behind that label, they were matched up. Okay? So what's interesting here is this one. This is a so-called branded term. We've all seen these subsections of sites. Sometimes they're very extensive. These are specialized portions of sites that get built out by interactive agencies, large clients, companies, and they term this something other than functional navigation level. And what you see is they launch these sites and they have terrible performance. To a great extent, and the initial impact in the marketplace has to do simply with the naming of the branded site's presentation on primary navigation. So if you change this to something that is more descriptive, even though it doesn't have its brand significance, you're going to have much greater participation. So basically what you see here is a couple of interesting ones. The other one is mobile. You probably think, okay, I'm going to put mobile on my homepage. On my main navigation, there's a ton of content under there. How could anybody misunderstand what mobile means? Believe me, if you have 1,500 respondents, you would be amazed how many different ways they can interpret the word mobile. So again, this is just an example of how you can redesign the label, your navigation labels, test it again, things move. One final piece here on this behavior tracking. This is an example of what the connector gathers. So you've got here, these are actual mouse overs, clicks, roll reversals, scrolls, pages viewed. This is 25 out of 100. We had 114 respondents who were trying to do this task. Only 25 were successful. The blue is what we call the optimized pathway. So if they came in and they performed this task the way it was intended, they would have had basically, out of those 25 respondents, they would have had 50 page views, they would have had 50 clicks, and they would have had about 50 mouse overs. But when you look at the actual data, you can see they had twice as many page views, a bunch of scroll reversals, a ton of mouse overs. Look at this one. Scrolls. There were no scrolls required to perform this task. So what this allows you to do is take all that subjective data, which I just talked about, and you can map it up against the actual objective data at this level. Okay, so it's like an eye tracking. There's realities here. Who knows about Fat Wallet? Why do you know about Fat Wallet? Turns out that the thing with these surveys is that there's think of it like this. Tonight, while we're here at this session, there's probably 1,000 college students, high school students, even middle school students who are out there taking surveys. And they're taking surveys for like Mercedes-Benz cars, or Lexus, or whatever. And this happens to be an example. Fat Wallet is a site that publishes message boards that do nothing but identify sites where there are surveys running. And so here, for example, a $20 Amazon gift certificate for completing a survey at Lexus. It's an enormous problem with fraud in managing these types of studies. So when you choose a vendor, there's two things that you have to really consider. One, what are their fraud management tools like internally? The second factor is that you actually, and this is contrary to good research, you actually have to scrub these surveys extensively to get a reliable profile. By scrubbing, I mean you've got to go in and you've got to actually remove respondents. And if anyone in here is a market research professional, they just got up and walked out. But it's a fact, because the idea behind the way these run and the incentivization setups is that if you can't manage the fraud, then you can't produce reliable data. Second thing about this technology is that the vendors don't always tell you the truth about their technology and where their servers are located. So if you wanted to, for example, do a survey, let's say investment bankers, you want to do New York, Japan, India, maybe China. Incidentally, you can do that with this technology. Where their servers are located has an enormous impact on the response time of these surveys. So there's a lot of back and forth in the beginning of designing a survey, especially if it's an international survey, that requires syncing of all of the various servers so that you have a comparable response time. Okay, so it's a great book, Beyond the Usability Lab. I wrote a chapter in this. I don't get anything from it, and with a couple of my colleagues. And it's by Albert and Tullis. Okay, quickly, a couple more. Lab-based. How many people here have been to a lab-based usability study? Huh, not that many. Mark has, for sure. I know. He used to run one. Okay, so anyway, lab-based studies, the basic idea here is you have a small group of individuals in a controlled setting, and you identify showstopper problems. You have a small group. It's fast, low cost, sort of moderate cost. There's no real statistical validity. This is what these setups look like. You've got a respondent here. You've got a system, say a website running in front of them. This is a one-way mirror. You have a tracking technician, usually clients sitting back here, 2 tables full of junk food. So it's actually quite expensive to do. And it's gotten to the point where these types of studies are sort of done in a way that it was never intended. I mean, these studies were designed from the very beginning to only solve one problem. And that is, do you have a critical problem that's going to stop the effectiveness of your site or your interface? This is what's called a showstopper methodology, basically. So here's an interesting piece of data from a real study with 24 respondents. These are the tasks across the bottom scale here. This was a video sharing site. This is a percentage of respondents who failed each of these tasks. So for example, we've got add photos from desktop, here save video, share with friends. This is what we call the criterion level. So this is the sort of the target performance. So we would like to see that on these major tasks, the failure rate would be sort of below 10%. Now you're probably thinking, that's not my website, that never happens, right? This is actually a real group, extremely smart, effective people. 9 months into a project, probably 500,000 lines of JavaScript, and that's where they are. This type of study is incredibly helpful. Just don't wait 9 months to do it. You're better off with a simulation. But this is why lab-based studies, a way in which lab studies are extremely effective. When they get into all of this other subjective material in such a small group, they really don't work. Quickly, a tool, if any of you are just starting out in usability, the best investment you can make from a technology point of view is called Moray. It's a $1,500 piece of software. It's absolutely amazing. You can take data from the computer screen, your web, and 2 video feeds. And it goes into a system that creates a screen capture. It has a time-based recorder here on the bottom where you can record events. So you can look at the video and you can say, okay, that's an error, and you put a marker there, or that's something interesting, you put a marker there. You can go back and search across all these. It's got an event counter here, so if you set it up right, the way you want to, you can count every keystroke, anything you want. You can set up a whole bunch of tasks with it. And beyond that, you can also do all kinds of presentations. It used to cost maybe $100,000 to set up a usability lab 15 years ago, 10 years ago. Today, Moray it's available to almost anyone who can afford it and can set up, has the time to dedicate to learning. It's about equivalent to learning a middle-level Excel combined with sort of Premiere, Adobe Premiere. Maybe not quite that complex. Creative uses for Moray, you obviously do with software. It's terrific for mobile apps. You can use group focus. You can do paper prototypes with it. Obviously hardware design. Rob, I think, has used it. But the other thing about Moray, which they don't advertise, but you can take any video from anything that's in one of these formats, and you can import it into Moray, and you can time code anything you want. So it's an incredible piece of technology for studying user experience. Okay, something to always remember here is that user research always equals relevance and reliability. And by relevance, we mean you have to test the right person. So recruiting is absolutely key to the success of user experience, and obviously reliability is related to, how you test them, the methodology. So it's an interesting insight here. The most valuable, important aspect of the whole-based lab-based testing is the respondent. The quality of the respondent. Are they representative of your user group? Have they been appropriately screened? And are they going to be reliable as respondents? Because don't forget, you have a very small number, and you need very highly recruited and screened individuals. So clients sometimes get this backwards. They think you need the whole lab and then the respondents, but it's actually the other way around. You need the respondents and then decide what you're going to do with the lab. The other part that's important is the task generator. You're much better off without having a physically presented task sequence through a computer than having it generated by a observer or moderator. And the other thing that we've been doing extensively over the last 2 years is eliminating the whole lab thing altogether. Because by the time you drag your staff to one of these rooms, they sit in for 2 days, they tweet about all the mistakes, everybody gets all worked up. It's much better to just take the smallest room in the lab, ignore everything else, you'll save a ton of money, you're going to get better results, and focus on the task design and on the recruiting. Okay, this is another great book. This is by Tom Tullis, Measuring the User Experience. It's by Morgan Kaufman. Okay, professional heuristics. This is basically rapid feedback based on best practices, no user testing at all. So a heuristic is a simple procedure that helps find adequate, though often imperfect answers to difficult questions. That's a quote by, I forgot who that was by. But anyway, the root is Eureka. Obviously, there's no cost per respondent because there isn't one, and there's no validity. So you ask the question, okay, why do you do this? The interesting point is that there are several categories of heuristics that are extremely effective. The first is obviously editorial heuristics. And we would all know these, Walter Mossberg and David Pogue, obviously. Then there's sort of informal heuristics. So who would be sort of the Einstein of informal heuristics? Anybody know? Steve Jobs. He's a genius at heuristics. He had the instinct, he had the insight, he knew how to project his own experience onto a very complex product development process without structure. Very few people can do that. There's one other form which is called formal heuristics, which is a review by an expert like Rob. Rob does heuristics. And that's a specific methodology. And it's taught in school, it's taught in graduate school. So an expert of that type can look at an interface, can apply the methods that he learned in a structured way and say, okay, this is what I see is happening here. And the data can sometimes look like this. This is it's a virtual world of some type. And this is no user response, only an expert in a structured methodology. And you can have very structured set of recommendations. And you can go even further than that. And remember we just talked about Moray? A great use of Moray is if you have a prototype, set it up on Moray, and then just run through the tasks and do all of the recording. So this is, for example, this is total time on task. These are standard tasks. And you can do things like just say, okay, how much unproductive time did we have in task 4? The orange is unproductive time and the blue is productive time. There's an actual metric for that. No respondents, nothing. But what you have here is a quantitative representation of usability or user experience that is mapped through a tool that's relatively low cost but very accurate. And you can do this with, let's say you have 2 designs. What's great about this is that you can also do it, turn the process way back. You can even do it with a paper prototype. So you're applying more structured methodology and quantitative methodologies to earlier points in the development process. Remember in the very beginning, we said the fastest methodology for identifying the problem at the least cost. This is a great example of that. Okay, automated online card sorting. Anybody do that? Anybody ever done card sorting? Okay, great. Okay, this answers the question, an incredibly important one is, can users understand where the content they want is located? So think of this as, you've got all this big pile of content over here and a website you're going to design. You've got over here users who have an idea about all of this content, some category, and in their mind they have an idea of how it should be organized. And you as a development team have your idea. So this tool is all about how do you match up those 2 sets of data. There's 2 sets of ways of thinking about solving the problem. Okay. It's just basically standard cluster analysis. The tool of choice is web sort. You can go on tomorrow morning and do a free web sort. I think you can use 10 respondents. Great little company. So this is the way it works. Here, before this session, we set up categories here. So you list items: lab studies, heuristics, online behavior tracking, card sorting, right? A whole bunch of others down here. So you set up your items, and these are like your subcategories. And then you set up categories that you think all those items should be sorted into. Once you have those 2 set up, you can then set up a simple invitation, online invitation. You send out emails, you can send out 10, you can send out a few thousand. And what the respondents do is they get a display that looks like this. They have these little boxes over here. These are your categories and these are your items. And they basically grab it here and they drag it into the box where it should go. So what this is actually doing is allowing you to gather a detailed understanding of the user's mental model in terms of how they think about your data structure and its subcategories. Now this is what the data looks like. Yeah, you want to worry about that. That's a tree graph. I still can't read the tree graph. I don't know. It looks cool. You want to intimidate your colleagues. Put that up on your wall. Okay, so this is the interesting data. And this shows the percent of times each item is placed in each group. So here we're looking at eye tracking. And eye tracking 100% of the time got put into UX testing. So what you can do is actually look through this matrix and say, these are all the things I was sure that I knew how users would think about. But in fact, when you actually do a study like this, you see they think totally differently than you do. Now, why is this important? Looking back, say, maybe 10 years ago when user interfaces were designed for the web, the idea was that we were all so smart that we would design websites and we would say, okay, we're so clever that users are just going to figure out how to use what we create. They're going to learn. Well, what we've learned through extensive research over the last 5 years or so is that that is dead wrong. If you want to have an effective website, you better design your website to match your user's mental model. So you better figure out what the mental model is and then implement it accordingly. So what's the single most important category up here? Branding, services, engineering, marketing, not sure, UX design, UX testing. What's the most important category? Not sure. Right. Okay. Those are categories that they have no idea where they go. So let's say, for example, that your highest profit analysis was GOMS analysis here, or some of these down here on the bottom. And believe me, this happens. This not only impacts your information architecture and your structure, but it impacts your copywriting and the way the site is structured on a page level. So the way that you read this data and the way you interpret it has many dimensions. There's one more chart. And this is the percentage of time each item is placed with every other item. So here you've got eye tracking, and its highest percentage here is with lab studies. But it's also highly placed with online behavior tracking. Those don't go together. So when you develop your copy or your text for delivering, the conceptual presentation of attributes or features, you have to make sure that the user has them lined up in the same way that you do. A great thing about this tool, which they don't push very much, but you can do a graphic sort. So this is a shoe company, and they've got all these different types of shoes, and they want to know, okay, well, what does the user think is a pump? That's not so important. But something like this, a little more difficult. Anybody in here ever do conjoint studies? Conjoint analysis? This is an amazing tool. You could think of this as a very creative tool. You could put in your items list over here, all the sort of functions that you're considering in your startup. You say, okay, I've got a whole bunch of ideas over here, and you make your categories. Great design, acceptable design, not that interesting. And you give them the study and say, okay, choose all the attributes from this list and put them in the boxes. Say, okay, this will make a great design, this attribute, and that attribute, and that. And when you do that, you'd be amazed what you come up with. It looks different than you think. There's two kinds of sorts here. One, this is what I've demonstrated is called a closed sort, but you can also have an open sort. I don't recommend this, but you can give them a list of items, and you can say, go figure your own categories. But the data, if you have over 300 individuals, is just mind-boggling to try and figure it out. Okay, finally, the last one. FMRI brain imaging. Probably not a lot of us going to use this week, but interesting stuff. What areas of the brain are being activated by UX design? And the description really is basically, they put respondents in an FMRI scanner and they give them some type of visual stimulus, and they track their basically glucose uptake in the brain. So, anybody know this article? No. This is the most interesting application of this. This appeared in the New York Times, and you love your iPhone, literally. It was written by this guy, Lizard. And he put, I think, 12 people in a scanner, and he asked them questions about their iPhone. And he tracked their brain scan uptakes related to this particular question. And the New York Times thought, this is amazing, because wouldn't you really like to know that the underlying attractive elements that are present in an iPhone is the same as you feel about somebody you love? I mean, this is like serious stuff, right? So it turns out this was on the web for about 8 hours, and then this happened. Okay. New York Times blows it big time on brain imaging, and the blogosphere just went crazy, because this article, published on the New York Times by a guy who wrote, a very widely promoted book, is basically bogus. Not that the brain imaging was wrong, because it is. It's correct. This is the right anterior insula, and that's the area of the brain that's actually activated by your, some aspects of interacting with the iPhone. It turns out, though, that this guy, who's just basically a branding guy, didn't really tell the truth. And it turns out that this area of the brain is also associated with a whole bunch of other things, like really bad odors and arguing with your spouse, things like that. So basically, this is what happened. This is probably this is a, anything about cognitive science, this is a who's who of cognitive science. And they all got together and they wrote this letter to the New York Times and said, you got to pull that article off, because this stuff is not accurate. It misrepresents what brain imaging is all about. And so here you have kind of an interesting example of designers, branding types, playing with a methodology that's very interesting. It's very graphic. It's very compelling, but nobody really knows what they're looking at. So when you look at the brain and you look at the brain imaging, you can't say, okay, I love my iPhone because that part of the brain showed that kind of uptake. It's just not going to be that simple. So always remember, when testing your user experience, relevance and reliability equals success.